Call the meeting to order. The city attorney suggested that we would have an objective maybe of taking an hour and a half. Nice. If it takes longer than that, we can move it on to the next meeting, but we'll see if an hour and a half seems like the right number. So with that, we'll cut right to 2.1, the periodic review of.
We have to do a roll call to start the meeting.
Go ahead with the call and roll.
All right. Please indicate if you are present tonight. Rod Axtell.
I'm here.
Here. Donald Barnes. Not here. Nicole Kohler. Not here. James Goodermont.
Present.
Here. Kathy Gustafson. Not here. Cynthia Hunt.
Here.
Here. Ronald Liddell. Not here. Damian Lastruje.
Here.
Emily Melby.
Here.
Here. Grant Peterson. Not here. Steve Peterson.
Here.
Here. John Stanley. Here. Jay Taylor. Not here. Mark Thorson. Not here. Carrie Weatherby.
Here,
Here.
and I have a question. The last meeting,
Yes.
was I marked as present or absent? Because I tried to get in on WebEx and I couldn't get in, but I listened to it. I could listen to
Okay.
it on my,
I think you are marked absent.
because I did listen to the whole meeting by phone, but I couldn't
Okay.
get in the other room. I don't have my kids in town anymore, so I don't know how to do that stuff.
So what do you do in a deal like that?
Sorry?
What do you do on something like that?
So, per open meeting law, if you want to attend remotely, you'll have to tell me in advance.
Oh, in advance.
Because I'll need to post it on the agenda and you'll have to be in a public place. Correct me if I'm
Yep,
misunderstanding.
yep.
But you'll have to be from a public place. I'll need the address that you're watching the meeting from.
I didn't have.
I need to have that posted on the agenda.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we have to be able to hear and see everybody, and you need to be able to hear and see us. So there is an exception that they carved out for being advised by a healthcare professional that you shouldn't attend in person. There's a little bit more room to attend from a private location in that instance. We still need to know it far enough in advance so that we can do put stuff in place in order to make that happen.
Okay, I didn't realize that because it always has these links on here, but it doesn't say
Yeah,
all ahead, so I didn't.
yeah.
Mostly that's.
During COVID, we had a much more room, but now we don't want to have state of emergency. We have more restrictions on that.
Okay.
Are we recording?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Let the record reflect that Mark Thorson has showed up. Elected. And we'll now hand it off to item number 2.1.
Right. So I have a PowerPoint slide. I feel like, Adrian, that I'm a little bit nervous. It's a little bit like my final exam for being a charter attorney. So I'm going to do my best. And I was thinking 60 to 90 minutes for discussion tonight. I've sort of gone through each of the slides and have some elements that I want to talk through on each of them, on each of the sections. And then if I don't know the answer tonight, or I can't get it to you in a quick enough way, I'll be taking notes and I'll just report back at the next meeting. I'm thinking we can get through chapters 1 and 2 and maybe 3 tonight. I saved the rules of procedure for the subsequent meeting. I think that discussion flows nicely out of the content that's in chapter 3 of the charter. So sort of thinking through logically in my brain and how my brain is organized, that made the most sense to me. I'm certainly prepared to talk about the rules of procedure tonight, but that seems, having been through that with the council, it sort of opens up a whole lot of other stuff. And so it might be more appropriate for a subsequent discussion because it can grow. Does that generally make sense for people? And is everyone comfortable with that approach? I'm seeing nodding heads, Chair.
I think that's fine. There's a couple more things that I want to just kind of pop in here. So one of the things to keep in mind as we're going through here is that we don't have unlimited latitude to make changes to the charter on our own. And so the easy route for making changes is that we go and convince every city council member that it changes. And that probably needs to be limited to kind of eliminating confusing things, eliminating obsolete things, or changes that are so obviously the right thing. That's not to say that we might talk about things that would be controversial or that people would have different opinions on it. But what we're likely going to do is take the things that are likely to be able to get through 7 votes at the city council. Once we're through the first batch here of these, and we'll bundle that up and go to the city council and ask them to, and go through the formal process of asking them to adopt those. And so if we do, if people do have ideas of things that they would like to change that would be a little bit, that fall into the category of controversial, or collectively we decide that that's the case, my suggestion is going to be that we take those ideas, we put them on a list, and we circle back and work through that list of things separately, rather than try and deal with it as part of this process. And so, not to say that we don't want to consider ideas like that, because that's exactly what our job is, to consider that sort of thing on the Charter Commission, but to try to sort things into the pile of things that we think we can get done right now and the pile of things that require more talking about. And that may have to go the hard route, which is, I think, the route of going to the voters and asking.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. That's helpful. The other thing to note, sort of as background, is that there was a model charter that was put together many decades ago, and a lot of cities adopted that. I've mentioned this before, so this is probably sounding familiar to some of you. So the cadence of city charters is largely similar in many, many cities. And we have much of that cadence still left over. That said, since I started here 7 years ago, I almost on every year around this time of year, I say to all the department directors, please do 2 things. Please go reread the charter and touch base with me on anything that you have concerns about or questions that you have. And then also, please put it on your department agendas and ask your division managers to also reread it and highlight things that are of concern. So as you probably remember, from those of you that have been here for a couple of years, we have been bringing regular edits to the charter over the years. Some of them have been clerical, cleaning up some language, typos, that sort of thing. Some of them have been pretty substantial. And we have had a couple of widespread updates. One was to the election law provisions. We did quite a few edits to the election law when we brought in ranked choice voting, when the voters brought in ranked choice voting. And then also there's the garbage language, this organized collection language in chapter 12, which we'll get to at the end, at the very end. And then we also had some sort of quite substantive changes to the tap room, to the intoxicating liquor section, to allow for tap rooms. So there have been some really intentional substantive editing, as well as regularized sort of review and cleanup on an annual basis. So you'll see, and I made an effort at the end of each section, in parens after the text of the article, you'll see the history, is what we call it, of that legislation. So as a reminder, again, there's 12 chapters. We're going to be marching through the first 3 of them this year, and the rules of procedure. So here you'll see, this is chapter 1, or section 1.01 of chapter 1. This is a very general section of the opening section. The information, they all follow the same cadence here. You've got the section header, the heading, and then you've got, sentences after that. Then in parens below is the history of amendments that have been done to each section standing alone. by ordinance or by voters, or sometimes there's special instructions to the codifier. And you'll see that as we go through here. And then one section that I particularly appreciate is at the very, very end of the charter is a list of every single time the charter has been edited and kind of a short version of what happened in those edits. So where it's been more modern, where it's happened in the more modern time, not modern, but recent times, I guess, there are live links in our charter, and you can bounce directly to the ordinance and see the text of that document. Chair?
Just to be clear, the language that we see first is the current language as a result of those Pren's amendments.
Chair and members, yes. The most current language that is in the charter right now is the language that is on the PowerPoint slide between sort of the header with the section name and then parens.
Okay.
I added this text here below about the effective date because I want to talk about the effective date of the charter. All right. So I thought that the two most substantive elements of this is the language about how Bloomington is a municipal corporation. And that is a term of art. We are a legal entity. The city is a legal entity, legally recognized entity. It's also other things. It's also a home rule charter city. It's also a political subdivision, but it's also a municipal corporation. So that means something, and it's used throughout our state law as well as all of our contracts. It essentially means, from a legal perspective, that we operate within and are subject to our laws and our charter. And what it means, sort of more conventionally, practically speaking, is that we are a corporation. So I have a lot more in common with another corporate lawyer for some other corporation in the private sector with regard to the sort of span of stuff that we're involved in as I would, as compared to somebody who does sort of a wills and trust practice, right? My city attorneys and charter attorneys are working sort of an inch deep and a mile wide. Employment law, real estate, and then the difference being, again, with us is sort of the political subdivision part of it.
So is a municipal corporation common?
Chair and members, yes. Municipal corporation, every city in the state is a municipal corporation. Yeah. And there's specific language in state law under the statutory city section in chapter 412. That contains a lot of statutory city powers that talks about cities are municipal corporations in the state of Minnesota. And then there's a provision in another part of state law that puts us into classes. I've talked about this before about how we are, there are class 1 cities and class 2, class 3, and class 4. And it's based on population. Once you sort of achieve class 1 status, which is 100,000 or more, then certain things click on. Certain additional powers and obligations and duties. We are a class 2 city. We are about 10,000 people from being a class 1 city. All right, the other thing I wanted to highlight here is the effective date. So this charter was adopted in 1960. And that is sort of the effective date of, there's a whole process in state law to become a charter city. I wasn't around for this particular process, but a lot of cities became charter cities in the 60s. Any questions on this before we move to the next section? All right. So this is what is generally known as the All Powers Clause. And a lot of charter cities have this. It is, generally speaking, a liberal grant of power to the charter city. And we talked about this before. How statutory cities only have those powers that are given to them by the state. Charter cities have those powers that are given to the city by the voters and in its charter, and then those powers that statutory cities have. So you'll see here how that kind of breaks out. We cannot act inconsistent with state law. So we can't do something if state law says we can't. But we can do things differently. We can give ourselves other powers that are not inconsistent with state law or doing things unlawfully. And then we can specifically enumerate some of our powers and do things more specifically in a way that our voters want us to do it, so long as it's not inconsistent with the law. And one example of that is the election law. There's sort of general election law in the state of Minnesota. You have to conduct elections on certain days. The primary is on this date. The general election is on this date. And then we have very specific things in our charter, like we're going to have odd year elections, for example. So we'll get to that in a subsequent section, but that's just one way of how that kind of works together. Another one was the tap room language that we had. We had a specific limitation on intoxicating liquor in the city of Bloomington until recently. Okay, then the other thing I wanted to point out is this provision, health, safety, and welfare. This is a really common cadence of requirements. So much so that we abbreviate it as HSW. Most things in the law with regard to local government have to be done in the public interest in promoting health, safety, and welfare of the citizens or of the city. So I wanted to point out that that is often the test. For example, when we're going to vacate land or we're going to do something else, it'll have to be in the public interest or for the promotion of health, safety, and welfare. So again, this is a broad grant of power, and those powers can be exercised so long as they're not inconsistent with the limits and requirements in state law. Any questions about that? All right. Okay, 1.03. This says a couple things that I wanted to point out. One, it's saying that this charter is a public act. That term means that it's something that has become law, that certain actions were taken in a certain procedurally accurate way and correct way to make this charter become legally enforceable, legally recognized. It is a public act. And then you look at the next part of that sentence. It says it does not need to be pled or proved. I believe the intent of this was likely something in the law called judicial notice. And when something has been done a certain proper way, the court is allowed to take judicial notice of it. You don't have to prove that it exists. You don't have to prove that it was done lawfully. The court can just take notice that it exists. So I believe that that's probably the intent of that part of the sentence. And then there is some language in here about when it went into effect. So it says here 30 days after it was adopted by the voters. Any questions on that? All right, chapter 1 done. I feel like we should ring a bell. All right, chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a little long. All right, chapter 2 talks about the Bloomington's form of government. We've talked about this a little bit before. We're a council manager form of government. 30 Minnesota cities have this form of government. What it essentially means is that the city council acts as policymakers. They have legislative authority and they stay at the policy-making level. And then the city manager, who is their only employee, is responsible, sort of the COO, the chief operating officer, the administrative head of the governmental entity and responsible for the administration. Chair?
Could you just comment on the comparison in our structure versus the city of Minneapolis and or a city that has a strong mayor structure?
Mm-hmm. So, the city of Minneapolis, Duluth and St. Cloud and St. Paul are strong mayor council forms of government. It's not a very common form in Minnesota. And in that form, the mayor is responsible to the county for the operation of all the admin agencies. And the mayor can appoint and remove subordinates, but is not but the mayor is not a council member, but they do sometimes have they can veto legislation by the council. They have to prepare and administer the budget, but it's subject to the council's approval. And the council's chief responsibilities are to legislate and set policies.
Mr. Chair, did I hear correctly that the mayor is not a council member in that form? I wasn't sure if I heard it right.
The mayor is not a council member.
Okay.
Under a strong mayor/council form of government. Used in those 4 cities. All right. All right, boards and commissions. So sort of at a high level here, we have many boards and commissions. They are in our city code under Article 5 of Chapter 2. They are created by city code, which is required here. And they have only advisory power, which is required by this charter provision. They only can make recommendations. So for example, the Park and Rec, or Parks, Arts and Rec, or I think it's called, the Sustainability Commission, the Creative Placemaking Commission. Of course, I'm blanking on their names right now, but there is a handful of them, and their composition, their membership, their terms, all of that is set by the city code, which is ultimately adopted by the city council. And the city council makes appointments to those entities. It makes appointments such as if there's a youth member and what a youth member means, if there's members from certain arts organizations or what have you. There's very specific in the city code. We did a bunch of updating on that a couple of years ago. And then there's another set of boards and commissions that are different. They are statutorily authorized, and that is the Charter Commission, Port Authority, the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and the Planning Commission. Those are separately statutorily authorized entities, and they, for the most part, have the ability to do things separate from the city council. The Planning Commission is a little bit different in that sometimes they have to make recommendations, but sometimes they're the final decision-making body in limited circumstances. The appointment process for those entities is sometimes in state law and sometimes in our city code. There's another one, another entity that the city of Bloomington has, and not too many other cities, called the Merit Board. The Merit Board is also referenced in addition to section 2.02 here, it's also in our city code 2.67, and it essentially it acts on employee-employer matters. So when there are amendments to the employment rules, they go to the Merit Board. There are 3 members of the Merit Board that are appointed by the city council. And they also hear appeals under certain circumstances, but related to employment law. Sort of not an equivalent, but a similar entity to a Merit Board is a is something called the Civilian Service Board, if you've ever heard of that in another jurisdiction. Okay, so what this section 2.0, having now set that background, what this section 2.02 says is that there are no other boards that have powers except the merit board, and that the council is the entity that has the duty and obligation to perform the actions. These other boards and commissions make recommendations to the city council, and the city council is the one that must act. This is important because sometimes there are questions at the commission level as to what their jurisdiction is, what they can take action on, and we remind them, both the staff liaisons and the legal counsel, that they are advisory. And they don't separately exist, but for the creation by the city council.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Is all that established in state law? Meaning our charter could not say that a particular advisory board is now something other than just an advisory board?
Chair and members, the advisory nature of them is set forth in our charter.
In the charter?
But for those specific other entities that are created in state law, they have very specific powers from state law. So for example, the Port Authority has specific procurement authority that is unique and separate from the city, and that's in state law. So the city council wouldn't be able to say to the Port Authority, you can't do X, Y, and Z unless the Port Authority agreed to that.
Okay.
I don't know that I have anything to make the situation better, but personally, I found this section difficult.
Yeah. Like, I had a lot of extra words is what I kind of thought when I read it.
Yeah, and I haven't a clue. I couldn't come up with any, didn't attempt to come up with any language that might make things better, but if anybody else had difficulty, I just wanted to mention that I did.
Mm-hmm. Chair, do you want to discuss that anymore, or should we flag it
I
for?
think we could,
Okay.
I mean, is the idea there, this might be a candidate for writing a simpler version and having a substitute?
Yeah, it's pretty low bottom of the
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. If it works, it works.
Yeah.
I think just to comment on this, I think the key thing to remember on this one is that when the charter got adopted, I think their goal was to have the decision-making really focused on the city council, so you had one place to go. If you look back a little bit farther than the present day, to probably 20 years ago, when Minneapolis had the library board and the park board, it was kind of diffuse and who was responsible for what, really, was kind of a question. In Minneapolis, the park board was put in place because they didn't trust the city council to have good parks. So they put that in place there. And so that was what those decisions were about, was about making sure there was like an independent group that did that. Now, both the library board back when it existed and the park board were elected. So that's just, that implicit in this decision was we're not gonna have a structure like that. We're gonna have the council be the decision makers, and so the voters can focus on one group. I think was probably the intent. So
Adrian and I are just double checking.
Yep, recording.
Okay.
any other comments on that one?
No, like I say, if it works, it works.
Record button.
Found it as compared to other sections we've gone through or that come later. This is really cumbersome.
Uh-huh. I've got it flagged, possible simplify. All right. 2.03, there's a couple of subdivisions for this one. Let me see, 4. I broke them up one on each slide. This is all about elections. Our city code, chapter 3 gets into more detail about how we do elections in the city of Bloomington. And we also have language in state law in the charter section about elections. What the state law says is that the general election laws apply to charter cities. So what I mentioned before about sort of the primary is on this date, the general presidential election is on this date. So we can't have provisions that are inconsistent with the general election laws. That said, we did do some cleanup back in 2022. When we were working on the ranked choice voting, we brought this all to you, some of you might remember it. We saw the opportunity to clarify an ambiguity that had arisen in our minds and to make it more clear. And then we did a fair amount of editing in our city code related to the general election law, both cleanup and also related to ranked choice voting. So in subdivision 1, this talks about how we have a mayor that's elected at large, and then we have 2 council members that are elected at large, and then we also have a ward system. So we have 4 separate wards in our city, and the council member is elected from that ward, from the voters in that ward, and then we have also 2 council members that are elected from the entire city population, as well as the mayor. And then it can, contains some language about how you have to be registered and a resident of the city. What happens when a vacancy is created. And it talks about how the term is 4 years and how a success and until a successor is elected and qualified. So what sometimes happens is that people think that their term ends on December 31st, but it doesn't actually. It doesn't happen until the next person is sworn in and qualified. This is relevant because if there's some sort of an election challenge, sorry about that, or some other nuance that's happening, something unique, then the person stays there until their successor is qualified and sworn in. The council acts as the canvassing board. And so after it's a ministerial function where they essentially certify the results of the election after it's happened, that has to happen within a certain amount of time. And then they send those to the Secretary of State's office and to the county, I believe. And then it says that you have to hold the elections for the mayor and council members as provided in this subsequent section. And then we go in and we talk about what that means in the subsequent sections of 2.03. Any questions with subdivision 1 before I move on?
One thing I had tagged on here, or I'm just pointing it out because it'll come up a little bit. But in the 5th line, there's that removal causes a vacancy language.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, this section also gets more specific about that later. And the question I had was whether, and when we get to the other language, we can talk about it then, but whether this sentence really has any effect.
Oh, here.
With the later,
Mhm.
here with the later.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and to your point, it's written in the passive voice without a subject, right? Also, so it's not exactly a great, super clearly constructed sentence. It just says removal from that district causes a vacancy. There's no subject. And so it could perhaps be clarified even if it stayed there.
Yeah. Generally, like, when I'm doing reading at work, a lot of times I will read a sentence and I'll be like, if I take this sentence out, does it? people are often like, well, you got that a lot shorter. And it's like, yeah, because I keep taking sentences out and nothing changes. Taking
Yeah.
sentences out, so.
Yeah. There's that quote, I would have written a shorter article, but I didn't have enough time, or something like that, yeah. All right. Okay, subdivision 2. This is talking about our districts. We have 4 separate districts. It talks about the boundaries. We have to set those boundaries by ordinance, and it's based on population. For those of you that remember, we recently redrew our boundaries after the census. There's a whole process in the law about how you do that. And you have to draw the lines in certain ways to keep groups together. And this gets into a little bit more nuance about that. Cannot exceed more than 5% of the people in the most populous, so it's talking about how you draw these lines. And our clerk works with our works with another department in the city, I can't remember exactly which one, to figure out which cities, or excuse me, where the lines can be moved on the streets and how that will impact population. And then produces some options for the council, and then they vote on that and set those boundaries. So you'll see very specifically about how those lines are drawn. You can't sort of zigzag all over the place, right? You have to keep things together, and it's talking about the nuance of that. It goes on to say that redistricting is a ministerial function of the council. And you all probably recall legal challenges to redistricting in other parts of the country. And so it's saying here how you would enforce a challenge to a redistricting by a mandamus action brought by a registered voter. If they fail to redistrict, it'll automatically result in withholding their salaries. And then it goes through and talks about each of the 4 districts, where they are within the city, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So for example, if 4 ended up being, because of some huge population swing, in a different quadrant, then we would potentially have to adjust this language. But I think the gist is to sort of keep it that.
When I read this, I interpreted that at least initially, the boundaries were meant to be in its simplest form like this. And of course, we've had to adjust over the years, but it refers to the north-south line, north-south street, and the east-west street.
Mm-hmm.
And we have several things in our city that interfere with that, like County Park, probably most prominently. But we just seem to have gone a long way from this to, something that's maybe not as awful as some districts we see nationally, but it's still not, it's, there's nothing remotely resembling a straight line from north to south, east to west. And is that just what we've had to do over the years to accommodate these natural obstacles, and as well as population shifts? It just doesn't look like the simplest districting that we ought to be able to have.
Mm-hmm. So, Chair and members, for those people wondering, the districts are on the city's website, on the city council page at the bottom. I would say that I can follow up and get you more information. I don't know the history. I haven't been here for multiple redistrictings to see how the lines have shifted over the years.
I don't mean to suppose for a minute that we're going to go into redistricting in this committee, but I just was wondering if you had anything, if this had been a discussion that's come up in the past, or to what extent you have anything to comment on.
Chair and members, I was here for the last redistricting, which happened fairly recently. And there was quite a bit of discussion about the moving of, sort of one line. And I know that it's certainly taken seriously and they pay attention to sort of the natural, I don't want to say neighborhoods because I think that might be kind of stretching it a little bit, but what's the word for it? Like streets and not trying to carve through a neighborhood, trying to follow neighborhood lines. So I can certainly get some more information for you. At a minimum, I can get you populations. That might be interesting. And chat with the clerk about, any.
I understand your comments and that's good enough.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, quick question on, trying to like balance the population so that the largest is no more than 5%. I assume that data in the GIS system only comes from census tracts, right? In other words, if they're like moving an imaginary line, wouldn't it have to encompass census tracts where the data is and not necessarily move the line and go one street over and say, oh, we've met it because we know how many people live in every house or whatever? I mean, is it census tract based, I guess is a fundamental question.
Chair members, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I can find that out. I'm not sure. I mean, I know it's tied to the census.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Because I feel like the city clerk worked, and I was referring to that. I couldn't remember which department, if it was assessing or community development. There was another department that she worked with to try and figure out what sort of made the most logical sense to the community when she was coming up with solutions. So let me follow up on that.
John, the way we've interpreted that kind of east-west first and then north-south thing and follow the streets is that whoever wrote this didn't want the council jacking around with the lines. And so they made it super mechanical on how you draw an east-west line that kind of, that is continuous across the city. And there's really only one way to do it. And then I think on the north-south lines, there's maybe a little bit more discretion in the north-south lines, but that
They could just as well have said, make an X, right?
Yeah. Now, like if you got the east-west line, maybe it's got to go up or down a little bit to capture a little bit of population. You can move that around, but it's only going to pick like, one block depth worth of. That's the way I read this.
I was looking at
That's what we're doing.
district, Sean's district, was that 4?
No, Rivas is.
There's a huge jog up and back at the north end of that district. And I didn't know if that was the park border or.
It's the park, yeah.
Because the way this reads, it reads that you run the line up to the park. And since that's not a population center, you run the line up to the park and then you continue it out the other side.
Yeah. Which
is not what it looks like visually. And I didn't know if that was, to what extent that might be an issue, or apparently it's not an issue because we've gotten to where we've gotten. But this language doesn't seem to apply, as I read it, the original language doesn't seem to apply to where we've gotten now.
Mm-hmm.
But it must, or we wouldn't still have it.
Chair members, I do know that sometimes there are large buildings with a lot of people in them. So you cut just a little bit and you end up picking up a whole bunch of people. And I know that that's been something that the clerk has been watching with regard to the development of the South Loop area. And that large buildings are going in there. And as we redevelop other corridors, larger buildings are potentially replacing smaller structures. And that densification can have sort of bubbles.
Let me ask this a little differently. The sense must be that the language as we have it now is sufficient to accommodate what needs to be done. And even as it's written with the reference to the north, south, east, west, we're still okay.
Chair, I think that if you'd like, I could certainly touch base with city clerk and ask her if she has found any particular parts of subdivision 2 to be challenging that this group might be interested in learning more about.
I mean,
I'm sort of intellectually curious now myself.
thank you.
So I had a question that I put down in my notes. Is it, so let's assume that let's assume it's time to do redistricting and the current district boundaries meet this 5% number. Does the council actually have to act at that point, or could they just allow the district plan to stand as it is?
Chair, I believe it's only triggered by the census happening.
Let's say the census happened.
Uh-huh.
We analyzed it and the census data showed that the existing plan met this 5% rule here. So that basically the lines could be left in their same spot. Does the council have to act on that? And that's, is there an affirmative duty for them to act every 10 years?
You know, I see, Chair and members, or Chair, I see what you're saying, that that's not specifically called out. I would say, as the city attorney, I would probably tell them to readopt and affirm that the lines of 10 years ago are still working as the lines of today after the census, in recognition of that. But what I think I hear you saying is that it's not clear here that that's a requirement if the lines don't change. But I don't know off the top of my head does state law somewhere say that you have to do that? And that's a possibility. I just don't have that pulled up.
Okay. And where I think about that is that the redistricting triggers the change in the length of terms. So like when Rod and I were on the city council, and I don't remember if this actually got triggered for you, but I served for 14 years and I had some 2-year terms and I had some 4-year terms based on the redistricting. We'll learn about it in just a second.
Yeah.
If somebody didn't want to have a 2-year term, that was on the city council.
Yeah. All right, anything else? All right, terms of office. There's language in here about when it first started and how they were going to roll that out. You'll see that oftentimes in charters and you see it in state law as well, sort of what happens the very first time and then what happens subsequent times. And so then you'll see language here that says thereafter, and it goes on and talks about how the terms play out. And you saw that happen here, and the chair mentioned that as well as a result of lines moving, in that sometimes you're going to have 2-year terms and sometimes you're going to have 4-year terms, even though the standard is a 4-year term when you're on the heels of a redistricting. There can be different term lengths. And what we try to do, and what the clerk tries to do, is be very clear about that and about what's happening sort of from a functional perspective so that everybody understands what's going on. This comes into play, and we'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about vacancies, but it's oftentimes less obvious as to what sort of a term you're being elected to. So for example, you saw this with Councilmember Mua during the last election. He had been appointed and, we had all 7 on the election, or on the ballot rather. And that was in part due to redistricting, but also then due to terms ending, but then also due to Councilmember Martin leaving the council. And so there were sort of the whole plethora of things happening that resulted in 7 council members on the ballot, or excuse me, all 7 members of the council on the ballot. The other thing to note here is that the term, the start of the election, or the start of the term is on the first Monday of January. We have a requirement that we meet the first Monday in January and start the new year. It's a rather sort of business kind of a agenda where we're creating the official newspaper and the official depositories and things like that, naming the council secretary. And the oaths of office also happen at that meeting when needed.
Does subdivision 3 have potential to be revised? Essentially eliminating a lot of that historical context for how the staggered terms were set up. Because when you read it in conjunction with subdivision 4 already sets up a staggered term after redistricting. So why the redundant language at this point? I wonder if that's something that's worth looking at in terms of revising and just clarifying the terms of office and then leaving the staggered term in the redistricting section. Or clarifying that it's a staggered term without having the additional dates and historical context in that section.
Chair, I feel like we had a version, and former chair, a version of this conversation a couple of years ago. And there were sort of 2 schools of thought as to whether you keep it in or leave it out.
I think I recall that as well.
I think my reading on it is fundamentally, there needs to be some language in here that anchor each of the offices to starting in a particular year. Okay, so you have to say like the mayor is elected first in 2023 and every 4 years after that, so that you know that 2023 plus 4 is 2027. And that has to be done for every office so that you can calculate those dates subject to the subdivision 4 language that you were talking about there. The question is this clear enough now that make that math easier? So I don't think we can eliminate the idea that there's a year in there that says that they're elected on this date.
So we'd still be back to doing math either way.
Yeah.
Even if we were to revise.
You have to know which odd year does the mayor get elected. Yeah.
I actually had the same thought. I was wondering what kind of value this historical process adds in this context here, because I was thinking the same thing. It's very long. And then it's like not until the very end where it says effective January 1st, 1996. I wonder if you could almost strip out like the first half of that paragraph where then you'd still have like an effective date and year and you could do the math after that. But I was also curious if there is, what the precedent is. Yeah, I know you mentioned that there's often in state language and other charters that have like this historical like intro. Is there a reason that they do that in state law and other charters that maybe we're not considering?
Chair and members, oftentimes it's because you need to know how to start. And you don't want you don't want all 4 terms starting on the same day 1, because then you would have big sweeps every 4 years. Unless of course that's what you want to be the case. And you see that on some boards. But what I think is I've seen more common is you'll have some will start their 4-year term on X date and others will start a 2-year term. And in some cases you'll even see like a 1-year term, so that you'll have more, I think there's all kinds of policy reasons to do it that way. One, is not to have big swings, but then also to have some institutional knowledge and some continuity and some sort of someone theoretically that has been there before. And, it oftentimes leads to a bit of more smooth meetings and, understanding of parliamentary procedure and all that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of sort of practical and policy reasons that they're set up this way.
But it's typically just around like terms of office. That's when they have, okay.
Yeah. Duration of the office. typically. And I think that there's even law telling you, I can't remember what the context is, that telling you how you start. Anything else on subdivision 3? I'm going to follow up with the clerk. Do we need more? Do we still need those 1973 and 75 dates, or has that been overcome by something else? And I'm also checking with her on the redistricting, readoption. All right, subdivision 4, and here you'll see the history of these as well, of these amendments over the years. I thought the most the thing that gets talked about the most here is the odd numbered year elections. And is that still the right idea? It has practical implications in that odd year elections typically have lower turnout. They're not presidential elections. And there's also a policy argument against odd year elections in that they have potentially higher costs because you have to put on an election that might not be happening in conjunction with the presidential elections or other even-year elections. Those are the sort of two policy arguments that I hear against having odd numbered year elections. The policy arguments I hear in favor of having them is that those larger even-year elections can dilute local issues. And by dilute, I mean sort of people only have enough time to be thinking about things and be, polled and all the things, and absorb information. And if you do everything in the same year, the local issues may have the effect of diluting what's happening at the local level. Those are the policy arguments that I've heard most often. There are probably others that you're familiar with as well. There was some discussion about this most recently during the ranked choice voting conversation. I want to say, Adrian, do you remember? I want to say it was $90,000 to run it. I can't remember the dollar amount. We came up with a dollar amount of how much it takes to put on a primary election.
We had a discussion of it during the ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also the election judges and the training of that. And securing the locations. I mean, there are practical realities to it, but.
There's also discussion a while back at the council about that because the filing fee for the council election was $2. And that was a very attractive price for somebody to trigger a $40,000 primary and then not campaign. We had a period where we had primaries where people would go and file just to kind of go see their name on the ballot, but really not be diligent about campaigning at all. And like in Minnesota, you spend more than $100 running for city council, you need to file a committee. And these people had such campaigns that they didn't spend $100 on running their campaign. And there's no way to get elected, on, not spending any money at all. Finally, the price got increased to, I think, $50.
Yeah.
And that and the ranked choice voting helped with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure. It seems to me that this policy discussion of odd versus even, for the reasons you mentioned, possibly others, is a relatively important concept. And who would address that? Who should address that? Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Nobody else.
Yeah,
But us.
yeah.
Well, I'll table that, but because it's obviously something that would involve a lot more work than we have time for right now. But I wouldn't mind, Mr. Chair, if that were at some point, probably in the far and distant future, that it would be brought before the Charter Commission.
It's a good topic for some,
Table something for a year or two.
put it on the list. Right.
Mr. Chair, I just have one comment on that is that, with the way our elections go, based upon, the media publicity, is that you can run into situations where, you get enough voters where they have this throw the bum out concept. Is that, I don't think from a city standpoint, is that I would be concerned that if you've got everyone up at the same time, the turnover in the council would be significant and create, I think, all kinds of situations from a continuity of leadership, subject matter, information and knowledge, and all the other things that go into it. So having a staggered approach to our elections, I think benefits the community as a whole.
Well, yeah, I
I think
understand.
it mitigates a big risk.
Yeah, and I understand the importance of staggering for a variety of the reasons you just mentioned, but do they have to be staggered on an odd year?
I think it's a good topic to have a more full discussion.
And honestly, Mr. Chair, I think we'd be remiss in reviewing the charter without having, just a discussion on the pluses, minuses of the two approaches, because it is, you've hit it. It's a big question.
Anything else?
Anything else? All right. Incompatible offices. This is a topic that definitely comes up, especially in smaller communities. I don't know, maybe only a couple of times I've addressed it here. And there are Secretary of State rules on it. There are campaign finance, I think advisory board opinions on it, Attorney General opinions. The Legislative Reference Library has information on it, the League of Minnesota Cities. It's a complicated analysis, and there are all kinds of charts. If you're the fire chief, can you also do this? If you're on the county board, can you do this? If you're on the airport board, can you do this? And so like all these different triangulation, or not triangulation, but dual roles, and which of them are compatible and which of them are incompatible. So this is a much larger issue sort of within public service. This particular provision is saying that no council member, including the mayor, can be the city manager or be an employee of the city, essentially. So our council members are not employees. That's, I think, the key takeaway here. And that's now a couple of years ago, and I don't think I printed it off, but there's also a state law that came on the books in 2010 to address a particularly complicated situation that talks of it, says notwithstanding any charter provision, neither the mayor nor a city council member may be employed by the city. And then they say employed means full-time permanent employee defined by the city's employment policy. So it's definitely been an issue that has come up throughout Minnesota. Our charter specifically addresses it.
Does this conflict with the reinstatement clause in state statute? So if they were previously an employee of the city of Bloomington, before they were a council member or mayor, and their term expires, they don't run for a reelection, they're entitled to the position immediately afterwards. Wouldn't this conflict with that? Because it says they're not allowed to have that position for a year after their term?
Or be employed by the city before the expiration of 1 year after. Oh, interesting.
So that would conflict with the state statute then.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'd have to interpret it that it doesn't, but that's something definitely to follow up on.
Statute number.
Excellent, I do.
So statute section 3.088 subdivision 2.
3.8.
088.
Thank you. All right, anything else?
Yeah, so the other thing I want to point out here that came to mind when I was reading this is that at the end there, so the way you've described it is kind of like organizational entities, but it actually, at least the way I read it, it reaches farther than that. A good example that would at least be a question is that there's the Convention and Visitors Bureau. And the city has a very strong relationship with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and tax revenue in the form of a sales tax on hospitality funds the vast majority of the CDB's operations. So one of the questions I had when I was reading this is that could a council member work for the CDB?
Isn't there something in the CDB board, maybe it's CDB staff, maybe if you're a board member, you can't go work for the CDB. The board member, whether it's charter or, I mean, whether it's council or appointee, like business community, you can't in turn go work for them.
Yeah, so that was an interesting question that I had.
Yeah.
Because finances and
Yeah.
activities is a
Right,
pretty-
finances, yeah,
pretty big umbrella.
yeah.
Not that I'm opposed to it, it just, it seems like it affects a lot of
Right.
situations.
Yeah. So Chair and members, this, I mean, we have a two, I believe we have two ex officio positions on the CVB. And we had ex officio positions on other boards that we don't have anymore. And we have, I'm just sort of running through that meeting of the first meeting of the year. There's a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of boards that we have. Yeah. That's interesting.
I'm okay with it because I think fundamentally this is about preventing self-dealing.
Yeah.
Which I
Yeah.
think is a good thing.
Well, and also having competing fiduciary duties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said exactly what I was gonna say, you know, this whole section is meant to eliminate conflicts of interest or mitigate conflicts.
Yeah. Just by saying we're not going to have them.
Yeah. Well, and there are other provisions in state law and in our rules and in other places that specifically say you can't have a conflict of interest or what you do when there is a conflict of interest. So we'll get into that later, but there are other sort of catches there too in the event something happens. All right.
Chair. Just out of curiosity, if nothing else, who determines if there's a conflict of interest? Who raises the question? Who procedurally, what is our methodology as a city for someone to step forward and say, I think there's a conflict of interest here?
Chair members, what I have seen done most recently is asking the Attorney General. It sort of depends in my mind where the conflict arises, what level of government it arises at. You would look to the jurisdiction of whoever you're seeking guidance from. And oftentimes it's probably the Attorney General you could ask guidance from for matters of statutory interpretation. With regard to this, I'm trying to think of who else. I can do some more research on that. I know for sure the Attorney General, I just saw an opinion from 2023 on that.
I guess my question more specifically is it up to me as a citizen to raise that question?
Chair members, I've certainly seen citizens raise the question.
There's no organizational provision.
Maybe the question is more formally, what is the process that somebody could be removed under that?
Do I have to be the
How do
one?
you cure that if you're not the,
Well, it cures automatically. If it, chair members, the law is clear on that. If an incompatibility exists, as soon as you take on the incompatible office, you have vacated the one previously. So as soon as you're sworn in to the new position, you are no longer a member of the one that's incompatible.
All encompassing, totally inclusive list.
Yeah, there are charts, yeah. Mhm.
so, but I mean, here's a concrete example. Let's say that, Rod Axtell is on the city council. Rod gets a job at the convention. The money kind of flows down that way. And Rod's like, screw it. What's the process in that situation?
Mhm. I will get you more information on that. I just don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, well, is there a process?
Yeah, there's a process. I just don't remember what it is off the top of my head.
And this does not address spouses. I think this section is meant to eliminate conflicts of interest and it really talks about, a single person.
Mhm.
And,
There's probably a lot of that out there.
Well, we've seen some recent news in Minneapolis with people in that situation. So
Okay, thank you.
I'll follow up. I'll get you that information when I come back next time, in March 7th, right?
correct.
All right. Let's see, we got 8:15, Chair. We have several more parts to chapter 2. Goes to 2.09. I can do one of two things. I can speed up, or we can just decide to talk until 8:30, or you tell me.
Let's see how far we get.
Okay.
See if people want to stick around.
Okay. Vacancies. There's two parts to this. One is, when does a vacancy arise? What are the causes that give rise to a vacancy? And then the second part is the process by which we address a vacancy. And when we find out about a vacancy, we typically, we sort of hear about it, sort of generically, and then, well, not the death or something, but like if somebody is gonna move or something, we'll find out about it. And then oftentimes, the council member appreciates a little bit of help in preparing so that they do it right? They, you want to do it right. And there's ways to do it that make things much more complicated. Like, I'm going to, 3 months in the future, I'm going to do X, Y, Z and whatnot. So the important thing to take away here is that there's a very specific process. The most recent example of it is when Councilmember Mua came onto the council the first time. And it's particularly, there are very specific timelines that have to happen. And if the council fails to act within those timelines, then the mayor makes the appointment. So when we had the process that resulted in Councilor Mua being placed on the council, there were, I think, 2 or 3 sets of, like, we'll call them interviews, where they did presentations. The interested people did presentations, and those had to happen I remember like mapping out the dates and saying to the city manager, you've got 3 dates, right? Like this is when this has to happen based on, oftentimes it's also a special meeting. And so you've got to get the notice in to when the special meeting is going to happen. It can't happen on holidays. It can't happen on, there's all these dates it can't happen on. And so as soon as we find out about something that's going to create a vacancy, then we start mapping out all this. And then you'll see it oftentimes you'll see it, I think, if I'm remembering the last time, we had it in the packet. We just laid it out and said, this is the timelines. This is the window. If you don't act by this date, then the mayor by charter has to take action. And then in some cases, based on how much time is left in the term, it can trigger a special election. That depends on how much time is left in the term. In other cases, you can wait until the next naturally occurring election. Any questions?
I had a question. How are they, like determining who's interested if they're like appointing? So like if there's a vacancy and like, is that, maybe I just not reading it well, but is there a notice given where people can have an opportunity to say, I'm interested in filling that vacancy? Or do they have like a list of individuals that they go look back on and say, there's a vacancy, are you interested in potentially serving? How does that work?
Chair members, I don't know how if there's an official way. I mean, I don't know of any official way. What I do know is that it's certainly out in the, it's almost always in the newspaper, in the Sun Current. And my recollection from the last time is that there was some work with, and I don't know exactly how it was communicated. I don't know if it was an email or I don't know, with our Bloomington Learn to Lead program. And that has been, and then some of our other citizen academies and those sorts of things, an intentionality to those to help people, well, learn to lead, essentially. And I believe that Councilmember Mua did go to Bloomington Learn to Lead and then piqued his interest and he put his name in the proverbial hat to, yeah.
There hasn't historically been a lack of people who would like to see themselves appointed to the city council, because it's a lot easier than running a campaign and getting elected. And in particular, in addition to like the leadership program that the city runs, the boards and commissions, there's a lot of people who get involved in boards and commissions, and they get kind of a taste for the policy part of being on the, being involved in things. And they look at that and they say, this is kind of the next step to contribute to the community and do that. And then word gets around in that group.
Oh, okay.
And people will, sometimes people will call people on the phone and say, hey, you should put your name in for this, and go ahead and do that. Right.
There's a lot of informal recruiting.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was curious, because it just says an eligible person. So it's like, where are they finding them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And my impression is that, there's a wide range of people in the pool of candidates that they interview, but they seem to always get a set of people who, are serious about it. Like the mayor was appointed initially out of the pool as a city council member. And I was one of the people who was in that set of folks. I can't remember if that was when you were around still or if it was after that.
I think that was after that.
Yeah. But he was somebody where until he came to the interview, I'd never met him. And there were a couple other people who had been involved who I thought, well, if, that they would be decent candidates for it. And then Tim came and was okay. And that's how Tim got picked, was a bunch of people, he came out of the, he did, and he's always wanted to do it. He worked at the League of Minnesota Cities. He loves municipal government. And he heard about it and threw his name in the ring. So.
All right, anything else?
Yeah, just one other comment to follow up to Steve's point is that, so I think we've been blessed from a community and city standpoint that when things like this take place, when there are openings, is that this informal recruiting and some of the, whether it's the commissions, et cetera, the Chamber of Commerce, the other leadership programs, is that I think that council members and other, and people that are actively involved in the community are always trying to find really good candidates. And I think we've been very fortunate to to have had the councils that we've had over the last 50, 60 years. It's just not right.
All right, 2.06 talks about the mayor. Our charter does not have, and our code also does not have too many sort of official positions in it. The mayor, the council, the city manager, the emergency management director, and this city clerk, council secretary, city attorney. There's a couple that are mentioned by name, but there's not a ton. Or not, some cities have all the department heads and everything. So here, this makes it very clear that the mayor is the presiding officer, and that the council chooses from its members who is the acting mayor. At that first meeting of the year that I mentioned, that sort of business meeting, there is a schedule that's adopted. Send it out to all of our people because it matters to us who the acting mayor is, because who can sign. And we have a rotating schedule that the council acts to adopt. It starts, I think the acting mayor right now is Councilmember Carter, when there needs to be one. And it goes, I think, at large 1, at large 2, or at large A and at large B or whatever it is. And then Ward 1, Ward 2, Ward 3, Ward 4, and then comes back up around. And so it's very, it's all known in advance in the city of Bloomington. Other cities do it differently. In Bloomington, it's acted on in advance. Everyone gets a chance during, a couple of years to see it and then do it and participate in that way. Similarly, the acting mayor is required if the mayor has a conflict or can't take action on something, then that acting mayor steps into that role as well. Or if they're in storm or whatever. The other thing to note here is that the mayor votes as a member of the council. I believe the rules of procedure say when the mayor votes. I believe the mayor votes last. And it's different in other cities. It also talks about how the mayor is the official head for ceremonial purposes and for purposes of civil process when you want to sue the city. Both our charter and the rules of civil procedure say you serve the mayor or the city clerk. People oftentimes think they serve the city attorney. You don't. And this makes it clear, sort of redundantly clear. And then it also talks, again about the ceremonial laws. And so the mayor will be the one that reads the proclamations. The mayor is charged with studying the operations and reporting on neglect, dereliction of duty, waste, and some of the provisions that we oftentimes didn't think we would use, we have used in the past couple of years, in that the mayor calls states of emergency and can take certain acts to maintain order. I think we had a curfew. We had some COVID things. The mayor called emergency actions. And then there's subsequent provisions in Chapter 3 that talk about how you do that. But the mayor is uniquely charged with that. And you'll see here that it says with the consent of the council. And if you look back in the Wayback Machine and you can see how we did that and would, convene emergency meetings to make sure that we had received the consent of the council when those certain instances came about. Any questions on that?
Chair?
Yeah.
For ceremonial functions, where the mayor, reference in here to the mayor acting for ceremonial functions, is the acting mayor then the only council member who can act in the mayor's absence for ceremonial functions as well?
Chair members, I would say probably yes. Yeah, Because the acting mayor can take on any duties that the mayor can't. Because they're not there or they're conflicted in doing.
Didn't know if, yeah, I just didn't know if there was a requirement that anything basically anything the mayor would do,
Mhm.
which would include ceremonial,
Yeah,
if the mayor's not available,
yeah,
has to be fulfilled by the acting mayor.
I would say yes, has to. Yeah, has to.
But an example of that is when I was the acting mayor, the mayor was gone. And we met with the bond rating agencies. And they wanted the mayor in the meeting. He was gone, so I went to the meeting with the bond rating agency. Now I, welcomed them and that sort of thing and sat in the meeting while the smarter people talked about the city's financing with the bond rating agencies, but they wanted the mayor. And he went, so.
Mhm.
Can the mayor delegate that duty and responsibility? The reason for the question is that when I was on the council, is I remember going to a couple of events where, they had a big event at Radisson, and I got up in front of the group and welcomed them to the city. And I don't know if that was done when I was on the acting mayor period, or whether that responsibility just got delegated to me by that time on board. I call up, so the mayor's busy, can you do this?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was.
I think there's ceremonial duties that are
Official.
official
Yeah.
duties, and then there's ceremonial duties like snipping the ribbon and welcoming and stuff like that. That I think typically, I think what happened is the council secretary would first call the acting mayor and say, "Would you do it?" Because it's your time in the rotation, and if that wasn't the case, then they would wrestle around and find somebody else for things like that that were like representing the city.
I guess I didn't know if any organization in a ceremonial situation had any recourse or any basis of complaint if neither the mayor or the acting mayor was there to provide the ribbon cutting or whatever, or if it just, where you draw the line.
Who you get.
Okay.
Yeah, chair members, I have not heard that people tend to prefer,
The one question I had in reading this is we get a whole paragraph on the duties of the mayor and the powers of the mayor. There's no paragraph about the duties and the powers of the city council.
that's true.
Call that to their attention.
So. None.
Mhm.
So.
Do you think that's because it says in the beginning that city council decides all matters of policy? So they're just like everything else?
Well, and I was thinking about that because I was thinking kind of along the lines that you were thinking about. And I was kind of reading through here, and a lot of when the city council gets referenced, it's a collective reference where it's the council acting as a body, not individually. And maybe that's the way it is, that the council members don't have any individual responsibilities.
Mhm.
That's the case. It just struck me because I was like reading this and I was thinking, okay, I'm going to get to the other one, and it didn't get there. So.
Mhm.
But the council members do have the same responsibility in terms of, it's a legislative body. But I know one of the things that happens in some communities, the council members become perhaps proactive for a particular project without going through the public hearing process, which technically is a violation of public law.
Yeah.
Is that you really need to sit and listen to both sides regardless of your position. And I think that is probably talked about for orientation with council members, but I think it's one of those things that people sometimes forget.
So we're at 8:30 and we're at the time that we said that we were going to be done. We've got like 1, 2, 4. We got a fair amount to go, so we're not getting through it. Do we want to see here? We want to go and get through the section 2, the chapter 2 ones, and say that we're going to draw our line there. Are we okay with that? Okay, let's do that.
Salaries. So the main takeaways with salary is that they have to be set by ordinance. It's not any other way. It's has prescriptively by ordinance. And it's a super majority. It's a 5/7 majority. And by that, it means 5 people. And then it doesn't take effect until after the next election. Those are the main key points. And they can be compensated for their expenses for city business. So, they has to be consistent with the public purpose expenditure policy and all the rest, but.
John?
If you don't have all 7 members of the council at that meeting at which that vote is taken, how do you have 5/7?
Chair and members, if you have somebody who has a disqualifying, some disqualifying events so that they can't be there, or that there's a vacancy on the council or something like that, I have literally a file that sits next to me at my seat there, memos that have been written about it, AG opinions that tell you how to handle that situation. In some cases, it comes down and it's adjusted, and in some cases, you can't vote.
Okay.
In some cases, you need all 7 people. So you'll see that throughout the charter and subsequent provisions, and you'll see it all over the code. It'll sometimes say a majority of all members, or it'll say a majority of those present, or a majority of the council. So there's different language in there, and that triggers different requirements.
I thought this
We have
was
charts.
here.
Hmm?
In this particular instance, it seemed to me to be unclear because it doesn't say either of those things.
Oh, chair members, I wouldn't interpret this as unclear. This is super clear to me as compared to some of the other ways it's written.
Does that mean like if there are 5 of 7 council members present or 5 of, does that mean it would pass? Or do you again just kind of readjust to what 5/7 of 6 is or whatever it might be?
Chair members, I would say some things are clear on this. If there are 7 members sitting there, 5 of them have to vote to pass it. If you have a vacancy on the council, I don't have my voting riddles chart in front of me, but my suspicion is it lowers it to 6, and I would have to do the math and do the research to figure it out. I will say that before every council meeting, I have all the vote counts prepared in advance and know what I'm going to do. And I always ask Jamie to tell me if there's going to be an absence so I can do the research in advance and be ready to go. I'll give you a comparison to another section, 3.04 on page 25 of your packet. It says an affirmative vote of a majority of all council members. So there's 2 key parts to that. Affirmative means that it has to be yes, the majority has to be yes to do something. And then it says all council members. So comparing that with this one here in 2.07, 5/7 majority is even more specific.
So here's a question for you. Does it, to the question that John made around the clarity, if we struck the word 7s out there and we said like must be passed by 5 members of the council, does that improve it?
Yeah, that improves it.
Is that our clarity?
I would think so.
Yeah.
You gotta have 5 affirmative votes.
Yeah.
Whether there's 7 people there or whether there's 5 people.
That's kind of what I was,
Yeah.
getting at. Okay, cool.
If that's the intention,
Makes it-
this, or the desire of,
The desire for this is clearly a supermajority.
so I think it's a good idea.
Put it on the list.
For those of you who are new, we got approached 2 years ago. by the city council, asking, pretty please, would you help us not have to vote to give our own salary to ourselves? And we said, no, you have to vote on your own salary. So, yeah, we've read that this particular section we've discussed fairly recently.
Mayor members, or chair members, there's also state statutes on how to change your salary, and they're largely consistent with this. All right, investigation city affairs. This is scoping out what the council or the city manager or any of the public officials here can do, make investigations, subpoena witnesses, administer oaths, compel production of documents, provide for an audit at least once a year, which happens, research and survey, do studies, all of these things all of these things happen on sort of a regular function of business. There's an annual audit that happens. Actually, they're coming in a couple of days, someone told me. We have a process whereby we have a new audit firm selected every, I think, 3 or 5 years. It can't be the same one as it was before. We have organizational business items at the end of each agenda item, where we are studying and discussing, or the council is studying and discussing items. They compel surveys. The oaths are administered by the city clerk. We don't subpoena too many witnesses, but they've got the power to do it here. I guess some ways they, in quasi-judicial actions, they compel people to participate. So, yeah, I think all these things are going on. Any questions about that?
It says that the council can at any time provide for an examination. How many have to agree that that's warranted? Just one?
The council can at any time. I think, chair members, I would say that I would interpret this to mean that they probably have to vote to have that done. And you'll see that happen. How I've seen it happen most recently is something that's been called sort of a service assessment. There was one done of public health. There was one done of the DMV. We did one recently of the earn sick and safe time. That subgroup of our legal department. Those are the ones that come to my mind most recently where we've done what I would say is probably the closest similar to this, what this language is saying. Looking at how much is it costing us to do this? What is the value that is being derived from that work? And the most recent one where earn sick and save time, it came up during the budget discussions and one council member asked for it, another council member wanted it as well. And then I believe there was a direction, or the city manager might have said, okay, we'll do that. When do you want it to come back? There was some discussion. Is 90 days enough? That kind of thing. So I don't remember if there was a motion. There might have been a motion, but there was certainly clear direction. Else? All right. Last part of chapter 2, interference with administration. This is something that we've talked about periodically. And I think most simplistically, it goes back to an earlier section that we had in the charter where basically the council is at the policy level, at the legislative level up here. And then there is the city manager and the administrative offices who are handling the administration and the management of the work. And that's the form of government that we have. And this section here says that the council shouldn't sort of dip down into the realm of the city manager.
Mr. Chair. I'm guessing that something like this then is in every charter for a city that has a city manager form of government, something like this.
Chair and members, I don't know off the top of my head. I will say that one difference that I have seen before is with regard to the city attorney. So in some cases, the city attorney is appointed by the council. In other cases, they're hired by the city manager. And in other cases, maybe with the consent of the council so I've seen it in other ways.
But I mean, in terms of like council members, not, the broad,
Yeah.
not interfering with administration of the city, going direct to department heads. So, I mean, that seems very fundamental to
Yeah.
that form of government.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. I can look and see a couple of other cities that have that form of government. I don't know off the top of my head. I haven't looked for this.
I mean, it's a good provision.
Yeah. Well, and I think it helps to keep the roles more clear. Yeah, because it's easy. It's just human temptation to kind of ask really, really nuanced questions sometimes.
This has had practical effect. It's not a hypothetical, it has had practical effect, so, go ahead.
Well, as I recall, when our former city manager was here, I heard time and time again that it was very cut and dry, that council members could not talk, almost couldn't talk to city employees. It was that forcefully stated. I don't know if it is today or not, but it seems to me that there shouldn't be much wiggle room in there.
I'll just tell you my experience is that when I did the job, I was very careful not to tell anybody what to do. And Rod was that way too. Rod was very careful not to tell anybody what to do. We could go talk to anybody. If you developed a reputation as a person who would use that to go try to get your way, go around this, then the door kind of closed a little bit.
Well, my reaction upon hearing about this before was that there was times when it would have been extremely helpful to the process if council members had been able to talk to staff about the issue at hand and get for information and clarification, and not to give them instruction, but to better understand what is happening. And that the policy, as it was at that time at least, really prohibited them from doing that.
Here's practically speaking, the tactic that you use is you go to the city manager and you say, at the next council meeting, I'm going to ask these 5 questions.
I see.
And I'd like to
Sure.
get these questions answered. And then the city manager goes and makes the machinery happen and a memo comes out and you get the information. So
Do it.
So I never felt, and Rod can talk about his situation, but I never felt like I couldn't get the answers that I needed. The other thing is that some people felt like they had the ability to create unlimited amounts of questions to the point where it started eating up the time of people and impacting their ability to do the things that the council collectively wanted to have happen.
Well, I don't recall the specifics, but it may well have been just some unhappy staff person who was voicing their desire or their opinion on the matter, who, would like to have talked to the council member so-and-so and couldn't.
So I did, my approach generally is if I knew the answer would be quick to give, I might call up somebody and say, do you know the answer to this question? But if it was going to require work to answer.
I mean, it's pretty well, except for the purpose of inquiry, right? I mean,
And I would send it to the city manager so that he could integrate it with other things that were being asked.
I think that when I was on the council, that we were encouraged to develop, maybe not necessarily working relationships with the heads of various departments, but at least get to know them well enough when you had, whether it was a public hearing or presentation, you had everyone was comfortable asking questions and responding. It was very respectful.
Yeah.
But I'm sure going back, oftentimes, whether it's the council members or mayor, is that sometimes you have strong personalities and you have, situations where you have Mr. or Mrs. Know-it-all that ends up crossing that line and creates conflicts in the city.
The other thing that the staff is worried about is that if I call the public works director and ask a question and then I get an answer, and then I tell the other council members, here's what I heard from the public works director, there's a little game of telephone going on there. And so, they, I think in their own interest, they don't want to be accused of like giving information to one person and not to another person. So there's some desire to try to channel that through the system.
I certainly think it's a good policy.
Yeah.
And you also have the public meeting laws you have to be concerned about.
Right, yeah. So.
All right. So that's the end of chapter 2. Anything that you would like me to do differently for chapter 3 or any other kinds of information that would be helpful in anticipation so I can meet your expectations for chapter 3 in the rules of procedure? If you haven't already read the historical document that is 1987 rules of procedure, I encourage you to do that before our meeting in March and flag anything in there that you that doesn't make sense to you in 2024 or that you have questions about. I have my own list. Adrian, I know, has his list because we work in this all the time. But if there's anything else that you'd like me to do differently or the same.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think this was very useful. I found it most helpful when you pointed out a couple of areas throughout the process where there's differences of opinion or approach. I think that helps highlight the areas where we might, just want to give further thought to. One of them was one that, might have surprised me, and it's like, oh, that's interesting that there's a different school of thought on that. And I think that's helpful when you do that through the process where it's not as cut and dry as we might think it is.
Any other feedback? Take that as positive.
Plus,
Yeah.
A minus?
Yeah.
Okay,
Doing good. I think it's the right level.
okay.
We're not reading each sentence out loud.
Yes.
Ron,
What is this?
That is a survey that Emily Milby in a different department asked us to do all the charter commissioners, and if you're a part of another commissioner board as well. Just to, if you want to give feedback on your experience as a commissioner, I think she's looking to see what can be done.
I thought I could use my phone and find out the tap beer menu or something.
That's encouraging that you know how to do that.
All right. Are you interested in adjournment?
Yeah. I can't remember here. We vote.
According to our rules,
Do I hear a
we
motion?
have historically taken a
Do I
motion.
hear a motion? Is there a second?
Second.
Non-debatable.
Say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Okay, Mark.
Thanks for it.